Hello, I'm Bryan Painter, columnist of the Oklahoman, and today we have with us Assistant State Climatologist Gary McManus to talk about spring weather in Oklahoma. Gary, I often joke with people that we have 4 seasons in Oklahoma. They're just all in the same week. Is spring probably the best example of that variance of weather in Oklahoma?
Well, Bryan, let me give you a little secret about climatologists versus meteorologists. Climatologists, they like things being nice and steady and smooth, and meteorologists, and I'm trained as both, meteorologists love variable weather. And when it comes to springtime, meteorologists love the spring. Climatologists, we would rather have, just nice, serene weather, steady and smooth. But when it comes to Oklahoma weather, really there are three seasons that are variable: fall, winter, and spring. And the summer, in Oklahoma, as an Oklahoman, we have 2 types of summers. We have really hot and dry, or we have kind of hot and wet. But the other seasons are all, variable in some way. But spring really is the top variable season that we see. And, generally that's because we have a lot more of the extremes of the weather. We can have severe weather and heat and cool weather in the fall, and of course in the winter we can have some severe weather, very rare, but we also have a lot of very cold weather and some heat but not very hot. But in the spring you can get all of those. You can get very cold weather, you can get extremely severe weather as far as tornadoes, severe thunderstorms. We can get the extreme heat, and we can also get the extreme dryness. So that's how spring kind of vaults ahead of the other seasons.
Okay. You did some research for me about springs in Oklahoma. Which stood out the most to you?
Well, once again, as a climatologist, this may be boring to meteorologists and other folks, but a lot of people would probably pick, let's say 1999 when we had the large number of tornadoes in central Oklahoma, or 1984 with the Tulsa flood. But as a climatologist, I want to say, really the spring of 1957, because the 1950s drought in Oklahoma was statistically the worst drought that the state had seen, and really up to that point and, points after. And a lot of people think the Dust Bowl drought, well, that was the worst in western Oklahoma. But statewide, the 50s was the worst drought. It was from 50 to 56. And then in 1957, we had this spring where the rain came down by the lake full. It inundated the whole state, and then we ended up with the wettest spring. It's still the most rainfall we've seen on record. 1957, not only was it the wettest spring on record, it also ended our worst drought, and so that was pretty incredible in my mind. And then, of course, there are other, springs that were pretty interesting. One of them was 1924, and as a climatologist, of course, I include all of March as spring. And 1924, we saw really probably our snowiest month on record across the state. There were up to 20 inches across portions of the state, and it really snowed across the entire state for that March. And so, that spring might be called the snowiest spring that we had. And it's those sort of springs that where we have the really unusual long-term weather, such as a wet month or a wet season, or a cold season or a dry season, that are more interesting to me as a climatologist.
Okay. When we're talking about variance, we really don't have to look that far back. We can look at 2006, 2007, if you will, talk about the difference in those two.
Right, and really the 2006 extends back to 2005 when we were mired in that extreme drought situation. And, it wasn't our worst drought in history, but it was definitely a severe drought for the 2-year period that we were in it. We saw our reservoirs start to reach record lows because, the difference between the droughts of our past, let's say the 50s and the 30s, and what we see now, where we have a lot larger population. So then we start to see more water stress. And when we had that extreme drought in the 2005-2006 time period, we travel into 2007, all of a sudden the spigots, Mother Nature turns the spigots on, and once again, just as in 56 and 57, we see the end to one of our terrible droughts. And so, that variable nature extends, not just from our past, but it's still occurring, in present day. And one of the things about 2007 that was very interesting, and it's one of the things that we start to worry about as climatologists as a profession with the looming presence of global climate change here. Even in Oklahoma, we see some changes. We had our second warmest March on record last year in 2007. And so, the plant life, we're an agricultural state. The plant life says, hey, it's springtime, let's start growing like crazy. But then, lo and behold, we have our 8th coolest April, and we have our normal freeze in April. And so the plants were a little too far ahead of what they should have been. And of course, kind of hurt the wheat crop. Really, in the northern parts of the state, it devastated parts of the wheat crop. And it hurt parts of the grape crop that we have up there for our burgeoning wine industry. And, we have seen those kind of changes in Oklahoma's climate. We have seen our winters start to warm, and therefore our spring season's starting to move back. And so when we look to the future, we do worry about that sort of variation where we start having warmer early parts of spring, and then if we have our normal late freeze, that could hurt our agricultural community. Now we hope that maybe as we start to warm, that normal late freeze will also move back earlier in the springtime, but that's just something that we don't really know as of yet, so something we'll have to look towards.
All right. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Bryan.